wish to acknowledge the land of the Massachusetts people where UMass Boston is situated and the neighboring Nipmuc and Wampanoag communities. We also pay tribute to the land of the Tupiniquim and Kaigang peoples where the University of São Paulo was built, as well as the ancestral territories of our speakers and moderators. The Tupi-Guarani people of São Paulo, Yawalapiti in the Xingu Indigenous Park, and the Afro-descendant territories of Ecuador, and the Afro-descendant territories of Ecuador and Colombia, along with the African diaspora in Mexico and Colombia, along with the Afro-descendant territories of Ecuador and Colombia, along with the African.
Recording in progress.
This panel is a tribute to the memory of Antônio Bispo dos Santos, a great and beloved thinker from the Quilombo Urtumi in the state of Piauí, who departed from us last Sunday, and his recent passing leaves a void, yet his legacy as a generous scholar, particularly in the realms of anti-colonial thought of African indigenous relations, continued to guide and inspire this panel. I am Daniela Balantazategui, and the head of Historic Archaeology in Latin America of the University of UMass Boston. It is with great honor that we begin the second panel of the seminar, Indigenous and African American Peoples, Collaboration, Archaeology, Repatriation, and Heritage. Today, we will address the topic, Building African Indigenous Affection Networks, Women, Education, and Activism in Latin America. The struggle for civil rights and gender equality among Indigenous and African American populations is an urgent topic in Latin America and beyond, especially in the current context of warfare where women and children are being used in combat tactics. The seminar is organized in partnership with Marianne Salum, Stephen Silliman, and Astolfo Arau. It is a collaboration between the Laboratory of Historical Archaeology of Latin America and the Indigenous Archaeological Laboratory of New England at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Also, the Interdisciplinary Research Laboratory on Evolution, Culture, and Environment in the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology of the University of São Paulo, Brazil. I want to express gratitude to the collaborators of the second panel, the Department of Anthropology and Native America and Indigenous Studies, the Department of African Studies, and the Consortium of Gender Security and Human Rights, the Department of Human, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at UMass Boston, and all other involved departments. We want to express our special thanks to the following students who have helped to make this seminar possible. Valentina Romero, our moderator, and Francisco Noeli, and the graduate students of Historical Archaeology, Andrea Chavez and Sara Jaramillo, who participated directly in organizing this event. The seminar seeks to establish forums and platforms for collaboration. Everything will be conveyed in 3 languages simultaneously fostering conversations and cross-cultural interactions between Indigenous communities and communities of African descent in the Americas. Our goal is to strengthen the bonds between these communities and the academia to share knowledge on topics of common interest in our fight against racism and gender violence. Another pivotal goal is to bolster platforms where we can exchange experiences, platforms that are rooted in women's ancestral practices, featuring community-specific educational content that is open and accessible to all. As archaeologists engaged in collaborative, community-based initiatives guided by a feminist perspective, we recognize the importance of establishing bridges between archaeology and the traditional knowledge of Indigenous and Afro-descendant women. A more democratic and horizontal access to research, coupled with partnerships driven by community interests, define the ability and responsibility of social archaeology to make meaningful contributions at various levels, addressing issues relevant to us Latin American women. The social movements and grassroots organizations led by Indigenous and African American women in Latin America and the Caribbean play a crucial role in advocating for civil and human rights, the bedrock of Black Indigenous, and Latin American feminism. These women actively fight in a myriad of political institutions, as well as in national and international organizations such as the United Nations, COPs, their local legislative and executive branches of government. They also promote the community feminist movement and the March of Indigenous Women, to name only a few of their initiatives. These are effective and indispensable efforts in the ongoing struggles to promote gender equality, economic and environmental justice, prevent the historical violence based on race, gender, and class, and establish policies to ensure equal access to inclusive and liberating education. These themes lie at the heart of social transformation taking place in different countries, territories, and communities, and the global stage, underscoring the need to include these topics in national and international forums. Today, we will hear from four inspiring women, but first I hand it over to Mariana Salum, professor at the University of São Paulo and also a researcher at UMass Boston. Thank you. Thank you, Daniela, for the presentation. Well, we will today hear from four inspiring women, as has been mentioned. They work in various fields, and I believe that they are the examples to be followed. We have Catarina Nimbo Pura Delfina, a leader in Tapirema, part of the indigenous territory of Piaçanguera in Peruíbe, the state of São Paulo, Brazil. She graduated from the Intercultural Higher Educational Training for Indigenous Teachers in the state of São Paulo at the University of São Paulo, where she was trained between 2008 and 2008. She's a political leader, religious practitioner, and educator of the Tupi-Guarani indigenous people, and a pioneer activist in the indigenous movement at the state and national level in Brazil, especially in the area of indigenous formal education. She held the position of deputy principal of the indigenous state school Aldeia Piaçanguera between 2004 and 2013, where she had previously served as a teacher. As an educator, she looks for alternatives to build more inclusive schools where teachers are intrinsically connected to their communities. We also have with us Maria Celeste Sanchez. She holds a degree in psychology and is a PhD student in biomedical science at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. She is currently the head of African descent studies in Mexico and the coordinator of a chapter about Mexico within the Global Coalition Against Systemic Racism and Reparation, and is an active member of the Estamos Listas collective. Her engagement spans projects dedicated to championing the rights of African descendant and migrant communities, and fights discrimination, race, and xenophobia, and other various forms of violence that these populations face. Moreover, she was a member of the Internal Gender Equity Commissions at the Institute of Cellular Physiology of UNAM, and in 2018, she became the first woman of African-Mexican origin to become member of the Senate. As part of her agenda, she promoted the International Decade for People of African Descent between 2015 and 2024, and other visibility actions such as the proclamation of August 10th as the National Day of African-Mexican Communities and Peoples. We also have here with us Catherine Chala, an anthropologist and internationalist from Ecuador. She has a master's degree in negotiations and international cooperation. She is a decolonial and anti-racist activist specializing in human rights and African descent issues. She has studies in anthropology as well as in diplomacy and international relations. She is currently the director of the first research center for studies of African and African American issues in Ecuador, part of the Intercultural University of Nationalities and Indigenous Peoples, Amawataiwasi. As part of her involvement in social movements and organizations, she is also an active member of the Center for Black Family Research and the Federation of African American Communities and Organizations of Imbabura and Karshi. Watatakalu Yawalapiti is a female leader of the Yawalapiti people from the Upper Xingu Basin, coordinator of Atix Mulher, and member of the women's movement of the indigenous territory of Xingu. She is the co-founder of the Amiga Collective and is highly influential on social media, where she engages in discussions on environmental, political, and social issues and shares details of the daily life in the village of her people. She is one of the founders of the women's shelters in her territory and serves as an activist for the preservation of her people's culture and history. She also fights against entrenched sexist perspectives and practices stemming from traditional customs. For the final comments, we have Maria John, a professor at UMass Boston in the History Department of UMass Boston, actually. She's also the director of Indigenous and Native American Studies program at the same university. Her research areas include comparative history of settler colonialism, the history of urban indigenous communities in the 20th century, especially in the United States and Australia, social and political history of health and healthcare, health activism, and indigenous sovereignty. She is currently writing a new book, Sovereign Bodies, a comparative history of urban indigenous health activism in the United States and Australia from 1950 to 2020. Valentina Romero will serve as the moderator for this panel, stepping in for Natasha, who unfortunately could not join us today. Valentina is a research member of our laboratory, and she is studying anthropology and indigenous studies at UMass Boston, and currently coordinates UNISA, the organization of students in the same university. So with that, I hand it over to Valentina, who will moderate the panel. Thank you very much, Daniela, Mariana, and Steve, for this great opportunity to be here with you.
Valentina Inga Shavija de Leiva Gue, Shepuku Ashwensuka, Misi Shoskwa Ipkwa. Lo que en lengua muiscubún de Bogotá significa.
This is my language where I say, hello everyone, I'm Valentina, and my heart is very happy to be with you today. I embrace you. Thank you. As a multi-ethnic woman and a Muisca descendant of Iguaque, born in Saquenquipa Valley in Colombia, I want to thank my grandmother Gladys for preserving the ancestral culinary traditions that have shaped my interest in becoming a student involved in the revitalization of the Muisca language, though I was also inspired by great Muisca colleagues in our territories as well. I also want to acknowledge the hard work of protecting native forests and reforestation efforts carried out by my Muisca relatives and community members in Colombia, to whom I am very proud to be connected. Thanks to them, I now understand more than ever the importance of these territories. Forums like the one we are in today provide a significant opportunity to discuss our struggles and extend our voices beyond the imposed territorial borders, recognizing the networks of ancestral connections that have existed throughout Abya Yala. For me, it's a privilege to be here today among many women whose endeavors in their respective communities uphold their visions and desires. Before going to our first question, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to our ancestors who engage in this conversation through our voices, providing their wisdom and strength as we address the topics at hand.
Yo les abrazo.
Thank you. I embrace you. Ipka mi sishoskwa. I also appreciate the participation and support of my colleagues from UMass and NISA who are on the campus watching this panel today, as well as all the student colleagues who are joining us from other countries. Ipwa. Now, some housekeeping rules. The session is expected to last about 90 minutes. We will ask each participant 3 questions, and they will have 5 minutes to respond to each question. We know that these topics cannot be exhausted in such a short period of time, but we ask you to stay within the allotted time frame so that each panelist can present their response. If time allows, we will open to questions from the audience, and then we will move on to the final comments from Dr. Maria John. To start with the questions, we would like to give Katarina the opportunity to respond first as our elder leader who is with us today. After the first round of responses, we will move on to the next questions for which the panelists can respond in the order they prefer by opening their microphones. Without further ado, I will start with the first question. So please, Katarina, can you tell us a little bit more about your journey as an activist within and outside your community, social movements, and the academia, highlighting your involvement in the struggle for territorial and ancestral recognition and claims? Note collaborations with other individuals, communities, and organizations that are part of this journey.
Catarina, te escuchamos.
Katarina, we can hear you. Okay, sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I am very happy to be here with you and with other indigenous communities, with scholars from Brazil and other countries who have joined us today. I'm very happy to have you all in the same forum so I can tell you a little bit more about my story. My name is Catarina Delfina dos Santos, Cunha in Bopuruá. I live in the Tapirema indigenous land in the state of São Paulo. I started my fight when I was very young. My story starts when I was a child living in the middle of the forest. When I was 6 to 7 years of age, my father decided that I should live in an urban area because he thought that I would be most prosperous there. But it is something that marked my history because now I can be here with you and with these great women who have joined me for this panel. I studied then in an urban environment, and it was actually very hard for me because I did not have any money to buy school supplies, basic school supplies, and I had to work cleaning other people's houses to buy books and notebooks. So it was very hard for me. But when I was 13, I then was admitted to a Christian religion institution where they taught me to cook and sew. And I worked with non-Indigenous people there because my parents did not have the means to support me. My parents were actually still in the Indigenous territory, and I was the only one living in an urban area. And it was very hard for me to live like that. I had very little to live by. So I studied with the nuns, and they helped me study. I completed high school, and then I studied business administration. And in 1979, if I'm not mistaken, I met the people from CIMI, and CIMI is an organization who allowed me to travel around and to really become an activist. I fell in love with this fight because I could finally really understand the reality of my relatives, my indigenous relatives. And then in the 80s, I started to work with the Indigenous Union to really fight for better lives for my people. It was always hard for me because I remember that at that time, my parents did not want me to marry a man who was not indigenous, and I was the first one to actually break this tradition. I was able to fight them and say I would not get married when I was only 13. When I finally married, I was 32, but I was most of all an activist. And in 84, 85, I went to Praça da Sé in São Paulo to collect signatures to help promote the new constitution of 88 after the dictatorship. Most of the people who were in that fight were men, and I was the only woman as alongside Eliana Potiguara. It was very hard for me because, you see, I had to also face the prejudice of men. And even my father said that I shouldn't be doing that because it was about time that I married and had children. I did not have children at that time. I was mostly engaged in activism. I was sitting down with other indigenous leaders, and I was the only woman. And I had to really find my place among men because at that time, women, they, of course, helped their communities, but usually through the voices of their husbands. but they could not be the face, the voice in a meeting. I was sometimes asked to leave meetings, so I would stand up, say what I had to say before I left. And then I organized the Juruna campaign, and we had some problems in my village, and I was the one who was organizing everything, but many people did not want me to get in the village because I could not be a female leader. But then I got Jurima to go in my village and talk to other indigenous people there. And that and I remember I was threatened by non-indigenous people at that time for all my activism, but it was not something that hindered me from my fight. I was there to fight for a better life for my people. And by doing that, I learned more about what my people went through and even what my own parents went through, which is something that hurt me deeply. And on the other hand, I was also very sad that I had to move to an urban setting to study. But now I understand how education was important to me, though I would never give up my own traditions, my own culture, my own religious belief, the ones that I share with my people, which is something that is very gratifying to me now. And the year 2000, I went back to the Piaçaguera indigenous territory because I knew that at that time, this was a large indigenous territory that was actually being occupied by many non-indigenous people. But even though we had claims to that land, there was this priest, I don't remember his name right now, but he donated part of his land to indigenous people. But remember, it was considered his land, a white person's land. And I know that at that time, nobody had any documents saying that that land was ours. So I went to that territory, which is called Aldeia Velha. And there was another territory next to it called Aldeia João Batista, where I know that our older leaders would get together to talk about everything that was going on in the coastal area of the state of São Paulo. It is an area that indigenous people would call Taniguá. I know that there was a train track that would go through this area, but I hear elders talking about how life was like there before the train tracks were even built. Sometimes they would have to walk 30 to 40 kilometers on foot and sometimes even cross the river by swimming just to exchange food with other indigenous communities. And by hearing about that story, I heard that I had to really fight for the rights of my people who had been there for so long and fight for women to have more of a voice in our meetings, our get togethers, in education, in politics. But up to this day, I feel that very few women in the state of São Paulo here in Brazil really have a voice and are professionals in education and healthcare. We mostly have indigenous men doing that, but we are fighting for gender equality now. I'm now studying to be trained as, well, actually, I was trained to be a teacher, and we were trying to find some balance between the number of men and women. We make sure that we have the same number of students who identify as men and as women. And I'm happy to see that all my struggles have bore fruits. We have many more women who now fight for our rights as well. We even have the Ministry of Indigenous People that is led by an Indigenous woman. So I'm very happy to see that women now also have a voice, but I was one of the first women in the state of São Paulo to fight for that female voice. Even though I was threatened by many other people, I'm still standing to this day. I'm still fighting to improve our indigenous communities. And I see that we have some legacies that are hard for us to overcome. I see, for example, that many indigenous communities in the Amazon region, they have very similar stories to the ones that my elders from São Paulo talk about. And I feel that we have to learn from our story here to prevent it from happening to other indigenous communities in areas that have been actually protected through these years. And I thank God, Yanderu, for his protection, because we indigenous people, we do not have weapons like the atomic bomb, but we have God on our side. We have our religion, we have nature on our side. And I hope that we will see our God really protecting our communities, because we know that the environment, Mother Nature, is now hurting. And Mother Nature is the one that provides us with food, wisdom. And it is so important that we value all of that, everything that our ancestors taught us as well. And that's why sometimes I'm saddened to see where our world is heading. But on the other side, I'm happy to see that female leaders and other indigenous women are now taking the lead and even participating in science and in urban settings. Because, but of course, it saddens me to come to cities like São Paulo and just see things made of concrete and stone. I know that this used to be an area that was covered in trees and plants, but now all we see is the gray of cement. We can only see large walls. And Mother Nature cannot bear this any longer. And that is why the global climate is changing. There is this elder man who always says that the world axis is revolving more slowly because it has to actually bear more of a weight. And that's why the climate's changing. That's why we have the world going through this global warming process. So this is what I had to say about my journey. Should I talk about education now? I don't know how many minutes I still have. No, don't worry about that. Thank you so very much for everything you have shared about your journey, Katarina. Indeed, you have opened our minds to understand the importance of women engagement in the fight. And that's why now I would like to also give room to our other colleagues so that they can contribute to their answers for the first question. And then when we go to the second question, we would love to get back to you, Katarina, so that we can talk more about education. But thank you so very much for sharing your experience with us.
Las demás compañeras, no sé si alguien de
So
ustedes.
now I don't know if any of our other panelists would like to go next.
Bueno, buenas tardes.
So good afternoon, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I don't know where you are in the world right now, but first of all, I'd like to thank you so very much for inviting me to be here to join this chat in a place where I'm very happy to share a panel with amazing women who have had such a long and incredible journey. For me, it's an honor to hear our elder Katarina, because it reminds me that we are only here thanks to what other women before us have done. And I don't want to talk only about my own journey as an activist, because Otherwise, it seems that we are ignoring all the other women who worked so hard to build where we are and are often erased from history. This is something that we often see in Mexico. We see that the historical contributions of African descendant women have been erased. And in many of our Latin American countries, we see the same. Maybe all of them. We see that women are erased from history. We see that racism has erased the history of African American activists. So I want to talk not only about my journey as an activist, but the journey of many other male and female activists, especially those of African descent, who have always and will always fight for our civil rights. I'd like to say that here in Mexico, first of all, we have been able to recognize the African Mexico peoples, and this is definitely thanks to the African Mexican grassroots movements that have always fought for their rights in their own communities, looking to achieve a visibility of their population and even bringing new meaningful meaning to the word Black, because this is something that was really changed in Mexican history. It was usually associated with the idea of wild or dumb, and we have been able to really bring new meaning to what being Black in Mexico means, showing that we have always been an important part of our society, and that the word Black is not only about our color, but it's about our identity, traditions, cultures, and our heritage, heritage that comes from African countries and African people that were taken from their own territories and were brought to what is now considered the land of the Mexican government. So in 1997, we had the first African-Mexican movement. It was started operating in states where we have the largest number of African-Mexican people, and then it expanded to the entire Mexican territory. Only in 2019, we were able to operate nationally, and I'm very happy to say that this is a collective work. But I want to say that I'm very, very happy to have been part of this fight with these amazing people, to take up the streets and public squares and express why it was so important for us to be in the Mexican Constitution. But I'm also proud to be an African American person. So this is one of the greatest achievements we have had, and we always have, well, and we have to see that we have achieved great things in the local, state, and national level. We know that in 2020, we had the first census that really listed African Mexican people, and we are 1.5 million people, 1.5 million people who see this identity or feel as part of this African Mexican identity. And I also want to emphasize our resistance, our resiliency, showing that we have not disappeared, we have not gone anywhere, even though they have tried hard to erase us from textbooks, from history, even though they never listed our names in any of the places that we helped to build. We are still here, and we are 1.5, 2.5 actual million people that still stand strong. So we have a very resilient African American movement, and we are joining efforts with the academia. We have scholars and other important players that have helped to bring visibility to our fight. We have worked together not only with African American scholars, but other partner scholars and people who have been allies in this fight. And right now, we are trying to build a new collective effort with Indigenous people who I know we have neglected as a joint effort. We know that many Indigenous people have also been erased, and our relationship, the collective history between African, Mexican, and Indigenous communities has been erased as well. I will stop here so more women can talk, but thank you very much. Oh, that was incredible. Thank you so very much, Marina Silva. Watakalo or Catherine, would any of you like to now continue?
Hola, muy buena tarde.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone.
No sé si se me escucha bien.
I don't know if you can hear me well.
Perfecto.
Oh,
Bueno,
wonderful.
ya
Well,
como igual se pudo, creo yo, leer
I
sobre mí.
was, let me just talk a little bit about myself. I'm Catherine Chala. I'm from Ecuador. I thank you so very much for welcoming me in this panel. And I want to thank all the panelists who joined me for this chat. I am currently working in the academia. I am part of the Research Center for Studies of African and African American Issues, but I'm also and I wouldn't say I'm an activist, but I help build new policies in Ecuador, especially in northern Ecuador local governments. And I'm also an active member of the Black Family Research Center, and I'm a member of the Federation of African American Communities and Organizations of Imba, Buria, and Carchi. And I would say I have the privilege, and I say privilege, quote unquote, to talk, because of course, we are never privileged when we come from racialized communities, but I have had the privilege of actually going to university, which is something that is usually a barrier for African Ecuadorian peoples. And I fight for other people to have the same rights and opportunities that I have had. I also want to say that when talking about activisms and African American movements in my country, I have had the opportunity to join in national and international efforts where we work collaborative, because of course, I'm not only Catherine Chala here, only a scholar, but I'm here speaking on behalf of a much larger group of African Ecuadorian communities and other organizations. So this is a bit about myself. My voice comes from these communities. And I'll be talking more about the fight of African Ecuadorians, but this is a fight that is not only linked to very recent events, because actually we are the result of a much longer history. And we know that many civil rights have been stripped from our communities. Even though this is something that is said to have been given to us, we know that we are usually left behind, and it's something that has had for 500 years. I also have to say that African Ecuadorian communities are the result of women who resisted the being taken from Africa and crossed the Atlantic to come here, but also the sons and daughters of people who were enslaved, and we're the sons and daughters of maroon communities, communities that fought for their dignity, for their development, for their growth, for their prosperity. So what has been my role in this process? Well, I have been fighting to generate new public policies, and I have learned from those who came before me, my parents, my grandparents, and our ancestors, just to show you that this is something that we have been fighting for many, many, many years. And as I had mentioned, we know that this is a very complex and multidimensional issue, and everything that we are trying to fight actually is the result of being erased for so many years, and therefore we have to be resilient. We have had to be resilient for centuries. As our colleagues was mentioning, we well, she mentioned that they were finally mentioned in the census, and this is also something that we had to fight for here in Ecuador, because we are often erased from statistics. We can say it's almost a statistical genocide, because it's as if we did not exist. But now we know that we are sometimes even in larger numbers in Ecuador than some indigenous communities. And this, and if the fact that we had never been really recognized shows that we live in a deeply racist society. So we're now fighting for political representation and access to what we are entitled to. And we now suffer a crisis of recognition and representation that, of course, impacts public policies and how resources are allocated to different groups so that we can actually promote a more equal society. So these are fights that are historical. We are fighting for justice, we are fighting for equality, but we are also fighting against new forms of racism and discrimination, and how we see our society accommodating different strategies so that they can perpetuate racism in new forms. So we continue to fight to be seen as human, and we know that the Ecuadorian state, nation state, was founded on a colonial and racist view of the world. And this is something that we see with ripple effects up to this day. So we are here to talk about our right to our history, our heritage, our voice, and we also fight to access to land and to our territories. And with that, I want to also mention the fact of land claims and another process that is very long lasting, because when you talk about slavery, unfortunately, African descendant people in Ecuador, they were left with absolutely no means of having their own prosperity. Whereas even after slavery was ended, the slave owners, they were paid even indemnities for the slaves that were freed. So that comes to say that African American people had no access to the land where they have worked for so long. And that's why I want to say that we have to fight these organizations, these organizational structures, and say that we also have a right to land here in Ecuador. So that, and I believe that we could play an important role in an environmental friendly new way of production, and to bring traditional production practices and collective ownership of the land so that we can develop our own methods of community, our own community organizations. Because the land is where we can really build a life that is more dignified for all of us. Land claims for us represents a very concrete concept where we can have a land to build a new community and we can build our own development. This is very important for our people. And taking into consideration Juan Garcia Salazar, a great thinker that has greatly inspired me, our land claims are actually part of our identity and of our civil rights, because this is a way that is not only about individual property, but a collective property, and our fight for land and our fight for territory goes beyond our individual rights and is really something that is more transcendental. And we have to take into consideration the history of enslavement when we think about the 500-year history of our people and what we were left with. Of course, our history is not only marked by slavery, but all the resistance that we have put forward.
21 derechos colectivos.
And
Tenemos el
that
decreto 60, tenemos
that is something that shapes our fight today for collective rights. For example, some of the things that we have been doing is really fight for new public policies and we propose bills to really promote rights for our groups. And this is the well, we have had some results from this centuries-old fight, and we know that our populations can now finally really enjoy some of our rights, even though there's a lot more to do. But now let me move into the idea of land claims back, because we have to talk about what we call the territory circumscriptions. What is that? And this will be the last thing I'll contribute to. These are special regimens of autonomous and decentralized governments that can be established by the freedom of determination of our people. And in our own ancestral territories, and by respecting the political organizations of these peoples, what we want is we will actually promote a new political system that is organized by an autonomous special regime where we will have territories where we can live as our ancestors did. And we have had this fight in two different ways. In first, we will have, for example, a specific territory called Concepción Salinas that I'll discuss further in future questions. So this is one area where we have been able to fight for these rights. And we also have a different territory in northern Ecuador where many people are from African descent, but here we have actually several territories that have been actually the home of these peoples for centuries, and we really believe we can have an autonomous organization in that area where African Equatorians will have a real right to autonomous government and where we can really develop a new community. I'll stop here for now. I know we have other questions, but I will open it for other women. Thank you so very much, Catherine, for these great answers. I see that we have a lot to expand on what you said, but first let's go to Watatakalu so she can answer the first question before we go to the next. Thank you to all the women participating in this panel. Good afternoon, good morning. I'm so happy to see so many women here. I want to thank the other women, Indigenous and African American women who are here with us. To me, it is an honor to be here with Catarina Nimbopurwa, who was one of the first female leaders of the indigenous movement in Brazil. My father was a leader in the indigenous movements at the time when Catarina started her fight as well. So I've heard a lot about her, but let me tell you a bit more about my story now. It all started in my own people. I was the son of an indigenous leader, and I wanted to really try new things that would make the lives of my own daughters easier in the future. That is something that I had in mind back then. I wanted to really know how I could help. I knew I had to make a contribution because I understood how non-indigenous people spoke. I actually speak different language from white people, and I knew that they would listen to me if I talked to them. So I could take the voice of my people to other places. So when I decided to be part of the fight, I actually thought that it might actually be too late because I started studying in non-indigenous schools when I was 15. And the first thing I saw is I had a teacher, a white teacher. She was blonde, blue-eyed, and she asked me whether I could use a different name because it was very hard to pronounce my name. and she thought it would be very difficult for my classmates to address me. It was one of the first things that happened to me outside my territory. I realized that that woman wanted to be someone I was not. She wanted to erase my own name. And I said, no, no, I am Watatakalu. I shouldn't be ashamed of my name. And I know that the names of other people, people who come from different countries, for example, they are also difficult to pronounce, but I have to learn it. And I knew that my white teacher had to also respect my name, respect where I came from. And that was a moment in my life where I learned many different things. I learned that white people look at indigenous people as intrinsically bad. Being indigenous was being poor. It is as if my culture was just lagging behind prosperity. But it was something that I was faced with for the first time. It was not something that I could even understand because my life in my territory was good. We had everything we needed. I had a house, a roof on top of my head. I had water to drink, food to eat. So it was very hard for me to understand why people saw us that way. And since my father was also an indigenous leader, and I always dressed as non-indigenous people did because I liked their clothes, I liked their sense of fashion, and I would wear things that were not common in our territory because at the time that I was born, we in our indigenous territory, we did not wear non-indigenous uh, clothes. Actually, most people even did not wear any clothes at all. We walked naked. That was normal, completely normal. But then when I saw non-indigenous people wearing clothes, I thought it looked beautiful. And then my father said, well, but you can dress as them, but you can also teach them to dress as we do. And that's something that taught me a lot because I started to finally understand how violent their perspectives were, something that was not seen as violent at that time. We had white people going to our territory to take picture of us. And I remember, for example, this day where a photographer took a picture of me and he asked me to actually move my hair from my breast so he could take a picture of it. And I knew at that time that white people looked at our naked bodies in a way that was very different from how indigenous people looked at us. And I remember that I did not keep silent because that's not something I ever did. And I told my father what that white photographer had told me to do. And my father asked me if I had really done what he told me. And I said, of course not. And my father put that man on a plane to leave our territory and never come back. But my parents taught me a lot because, as I said, my father was a leader in indigenous movements, and he always encouraged me to have a voice. And in my culture, even, well, given that I have always been an indigenous leader, I was treated as an adult from a very young age. I was a child, but I was already a voice for my people. And I always wanted other women, other girls to have the same voice, to be prepared, to be taught how to be a leader. And that's why, when I got older, I really joined efforts with other regional and national leadership to really promote female empowerment among indigenous communities, because I've seen in different indigenous territories women being left aside because men sometimes want to silence female voices. We know that women at home, they have a voice, But with non-Indigenous culture impacting our territories, what I've seen is that we have often been seen as someone who should not be heard, not at the community level. And now I work at Terra Indígena Xingu movement. I'm the coordinator of the women's movement. We call it Aptix Mulher. And I've met also women groups from UN, and I said that, okay, so I want, actually, this is where I got inspiration from. I knew there is like a women's group at the UN, and we decided to do a women's group as well at the indigenous movement in Brazil. So it is currently called the Women's Movement of the Indigenous Territory of Xingu, MMTIX. So we have women leaders from all the territories that are part of our movement, because we wanted to show that we women, we have a voice, and we will have a voice in our territories. Why should we be left behind? Why should we be silenced? So this is something that was started by a few female leaders, but we have been able to expand it, and it is a large, large movement of female indigenous people. And we have women from all across Brazil joining efforts. I'm also part of the Indigenous Women Group, one of the co-founders of Amiga, because we knew that women were often seen as second-class citizens even in the indigenous movements. They said, oh no, at this time we will have a round table for women only, but it was just at that particular time. Women will talk about birth and women-related issues. But these forums were always at very odd hours, like 11 p.m., 10 p.m., midnight. And then we decided that we would organize our own events where we would have a voice on all topics, which is what we currently call the Marcha das Mulheres, or the Women's March. And this is where we help many women to participate more.
Watatakalu.
Watatakalu, are you still with us? I think you have frozen, so we're sorry. And one more thing, we have Maria Celeste Surgia. She had to leave the call for now, and we hope that she is well. Let's see if Watatakalu is back. And then we can go back to the next question. I think she accidentally dropped, so we can go to the next. Sure, thank you so very much for our colleagues. As I said, Celeste had to leave because of an earthquake in Mexico, but I want to say that everything that has been said here has been very moving, and what you have done in your territories is something that is incredibly inspiring, which also moves us to continue our own fight. One of the things that I see from this conversation is the topic of education. And then I can talk about what we call conventional education and how it contrasts with traditional knowledge coming from indigenous and communities of African descent. With that, I ask you the second question, and I want to remind you that we do not have a specific order on how you want to respond. But please, if you could tell us how you perceive conventional education as we call within four walls, imposed from outside, in contrast to other ways of transmitting knowledge, including the revitalization of orality, language, and ancestral practices. And is it possible to establish an effective dialogue that addresses community demands between these ancestral forms of knowledge and universities, museums, institutions related to heritage preservation? Okay, so in terms of this education, you mentioned within four walls, right? And that's how I studied. I was enclosed, and there were four walls around me because I was in a classroom. But in our traditional communities, we learn that education is something that is provided to us at OPA, which is the religious area. And that's where we are educated. We learn about our culture, what we can and can't do, what we must and must not do. We learn our practices. And this was something that I was very happy to do. And when I left my village and was put in a school, up to that time, actually, that I finished high school. I studied business administration, and I was 32. I got married, and that's when I stopped studying for a bit. I stopped my activism for a while. I had four children, and in the year 2000, I went back to all of that. It's when I went back to the Piaçaguera Indigenous Territory, and I was named the leader of that territory. Actually, four different communities recognized me as their leader. And 1 year later, we had well, the new intercultural teachers training promoted by the University of São Paulo. And I was chosen by my community to take that training because I spoke both languages. I had completed high school. So I was chosen to take this intercultural teachers training at the University of São Paulo. So I had to spend 15 days at the University of São Paulo, 15 days at my village. And I had four children at that time, and I had to actually take my four children to university because for Indigenous people, it's very hard for us to just leave our children behind. So they came with me to São Paulo, and they were with me at the university, and I fought very hard for that because I really think that Indigenous people should have their own universities. I would love the Tupi people to have access to higher education. And we got 5 different Indigenous groups in the intercultural training. Guarani people, Terena people, Kaigang people, and Krenak people, plus mine. But no one really recognized Tupi Guarani. They said that we were only Guarani. But we we spoke a different language from the one that they thought we did. So one of the things I had to fight for at university was the recognition of my specific ethnicity, the Tupi-Guarani ethnicity. But I had to really fight for that even inside university. I had to face different professors because, as I mentioned, I went to school, but most of all, I learned from the elders of my young community. I learned from my religious leaders because we usually say that we do not have a religion, but we have a spiritual connection to God, and God is expressed in nature, trees, rivers, animals. These were all things that were built by God and therefore are a representation of God in land. And after that, in 2002, I I served as a teacher for the first time, actually. I started working as a teacher, and I taught differently from white teachers did because I did not really feel comfortable within four walls. And since I live close to the beach, I would take the children to the beach with me. We went to the middle of the forest to talk about sciences and geography. And in the first meeting we had of indigenous leaders of the state of São Paulo, I attended, and I saw many leaders talking about what it would be like to have the first school, or actually the first classroom for indigenous education. And I heard many of their ideas, and I tried to reflect that on my own practices, but it was very hard because whenever I suggested something, my supervisor would rule it out. When I wanted to go outside the classroom, my supervisor would say that I could not do that. So I really had to fight for these practices, not because I wanted to do whatever came to mind and I did not want it to be disagreed with, but I wanted to propose a new mode of education. I served as a teacher for many years, and I actually sort of gave up because I could not do anything that I found right. And it felt as if I was not doing what my leaders expected of me. That's why I left the school. But to this day, I fight for that education. I got into a master's program at the University of São Paulo. I didn't even think I would pass because I was 60 at the time. I was actually ranked first and I started the program, but I had to stop after 1 year. But I'm very proud to see that I know a bit about what the world is like through the lenses of non-Indigenous people because it helps me to really build bridges and to make the voices of my people heard in non-Indigenous settings. So what I learned in non-Indigenous schools and non-Indigenous educational institutions, I use to bring more prosperity to my own community, to my own relatives, and unfortunately, I could not complete my master's, but it is something that I talk about with my sons, my my children, my grandchildren, and my relatives. So I encourage them to study, especially because technology is something that is very important. I don't know what it is like in different states, but here in São Paulo, all rivers are polluted. Most indigenous territories are very close to urban areas, and we cannot live as we used to because we do not get all our food from the land anymore. So we have to learn more about technology so we can actually have more prosperous communities without, of course, letting go of our own traditional ways in our communities. And I always tell professors, teachers, and my communities that we have to learn about our traditional ways. We have to actually revitalize our history and our language because our identity is intrinsically linked to that. And without identity, it is difficult to fight. As Watatakalu said, we have always been seen as poor communities in Brazil, but we are rich. We are rich in culture, in religion, in land. It is not, it hasn't been long since white people actually acknowledge that we have a soul and that we are just as human as anyone else. It doesn't matter whether you're black, whether you're German, French, whether you have blue eyes or brown eyes, we are all human beings. We are all equal in that sense. And I respect every human being. To me, we are all human beings, and God made us this way. we all come from the same source. I am born the same way anyone else is born, and I will die as anyone else will die, and we do not take anything from this land. So we have to really show faith in God so that we can live a prosperous life here, but most of all for our soul to ascend to a place that is of all of us, not only indigenous people, but human beings. And I'd say that to say that you're not going to be an expert only through what you learn in among four walls. You can learn from different spaces that you are present at. For example, after I graduated from school, I have always had people come to me to ask me to visit schools again to talk about education, about healthcare, because I have been in so many places that I have learned so much about so many things that I know that I have to contribute. We had a project that we will now actually start at the University of the State of São Paulo, Unifesp, and I'm very happy to actually be able to do that, to start new projects, and to tell my story to younger generations so that they know that education is important, but we cannot let go of our own culture. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Catarina, for your comment. Before I go to the next women, two very short things. Due to the, actually, in the interest of time, we will only have two questions, so you can answer with more content. But we also want to say that it seems that in Mexico, we have had an earthquake. So our thoughts are with our colleagues and relatives in Mexico. With that, I hand it over to Watatakalu. I know that you had frozen before, but now you can answer the second question. And after that, we can go to Catherine. And we will end with Maria John. Thank you very much. And Watatakalu, the floor is yours. Oh, actually, it seems that she has dropped again. So let's now wait for her to join. And while we do that, maybe Catherine, if you're still with us, if you would like to comment on the second question, well, the floor is yours. Sure. Thank you so very much. Okay, so on the question that you asked, I see Catarina talking about very important things that we also see here in Ecuador. We were first taught a single history that erases our own participation and also erases the traditional knowledge and contributions of Indigenous and African American communities. This is knowledge that was then actually removed from formal education, or that education within four walls, as you called it. And when we went to school, we didn't hear anything about our own history, as if we were not subjects, we were not really active players in that story. And I'm very sad to say that we were not even part of the national curriculum. What we learned about ourselves were things that we learned from our own communities. We would sit in our own traditional parties and festivities where we learned about our history and about our traditional knowledge. But we have to look inwards and outwards because we also have to find within our communities to strengthen our identity, but we have to find outwards as well, let's say, to get other people to recognize and appreciate our traditional knowledge. And starting in the 90s here in Ecuador, we really focused on a project called the Maroon Education. It was a axis of fight of African Equatorian peoples. As I was mentioning earlier, the idea was for the state that had silenced our existence and erased our history could recognize our existence, but we, as I mentioned, also wanted our own people to really appreciate our traditional knowledges, practices, customs, and perspectives on life, which are interconnected with actuality, our territories. So everything is actually part of a single point of view, a single perspective of life. And this is a fight that we have started many generations ago. As I mentioned, we have been fighting for almost 500 years, more than 500 years. And in that sense, as I mentioned as well, I'm part of the African and African American research. And we have an intercultural university that actually emerges and it stems from the fight of Indigenous and African American peoples in Ecuador. And the idea is for us to really build scientific knowledge that bridges the gap with traditional knowledge so that we can actually listen to both to build knowledge. So this is a university that really recognizes traditional knowledge by traditional people, by Indigenous and African American people, things that are usually neglected by other formal institutions. So we are now empowering this knowledge inside universities and in this intercultural University of Nationalities and Indigenous Peoples. We also talk about how we can build a truly intercultural and plurinational stage. So the idea is to also look at Maroon communities to understand how we can build free societies. In that sense, we have the African and African American Issues Research Center. It was the first in Ecuador, at least in higher education, that is connected to a formal institution, a formal university. And when we wanted to found it, we did not even know how to start it because it was the first time we had something like that in Ecuador. But it was a place for us to really translate the fight of African American leaders to higher education. So we got things that we heard in our communities, things that we learned from these long-term fight so that we could write them down in on paper to really design, to really establish a research center where we can study the political, cultural, social, and economical aspects of the African diaspora in the Americas and also of sub-Saharan Africa itself. And we also want to include here and develop the traditional knowledges of African American people and African peoples by listening to them, people who for so long have been silenced because they were actually removed from university and therefore were seen as people who had nothing to contribute. But we know that these are people who are wise and who have a lot to share because they have had this knowledge built for centuries. These are knowledge that has been shared generation through generation, and it is very important that we study oral traditions as well, because this is how much of our knowledge has been passed on through generations. So we have research initiatives that investigates these problems, and we are also looking for ways to form professors or form teachers. We had, for example, now 5 disciplines in our research center that we want to bring to the university so that we can really focus on how we can train teachers to really talk and promote our knowledges and our history. Because we used to say that African Ecuadorians were only the result of enslavement, but that means that we erase all the other contributions on the advocacy of African Ecuadorian history in our country. Our story does not start or end with slavery. We have so much to share about our history. There's so much we have done, and these are things that we want to recover in our research center. We want to actually respond to this historical unmet demand of African Ecuadorian peoples that need to have their story told. That shows that we are not only objects in history, we are not just chattel, and we are not always passive, but we were actually active players in history. And as I mentioned earlier, one of our projects is to really research the memory sites in different parts of Ecuador, in northern Ecuador, for example, so that we can actually protect our heritage. And I want to thank all the institutions that are taking part of these initiatives, because we have many different members and institutions that have joined forces to really make that possible. We are building now a project with our community and for our community. And the community is the one who tells us what they need and what they understand by their own heritage and by protection of their heritage. So we propose ideas, but it's not only done by scholars. We really have this collaborative effort with the communities themselves so that they have a voice. And I'll stop here because I know that we are short on time, but this is a bit of what we are doing in Ecuador. And we do not lower heads to what traditional universities do. We really want to change policies, and we want to let everyone know that our communities have men and women who have knowledge that is as important as that of Western communities. Thank you so very much, Catherine. And now I would like to hand it over to Maria Celeste and Catherine, well, who has been able to rejoin us. Thank you so very much for coming back to the issue, because I know that you had some, well, it seems you had an earthquake in Mexico and you still rejoined the session. So thank you so very much. And if you want to answer the second question now, please, the floor is yours. Well, yes, thank you so very much for understanding the situation. It seems that everything is well. Uh, the floor trembled and it was sort of scary, but it seems everything is okay. And let me tell a bit more about how I see this question. Yes, so I will try to show you a bit more about what we're doing in Mexico and how do we perceive conventional education, the education within four walls, as you called it, and how we can really recover our language and our traditional practices, and inside universities, museums, and other institutes. Well, because you see, this year, we finally approved an agreement that we had been working for many years, where we finally have the first African-Mexican university in Oaxaca. It will actually, it has just been signed. We are going to start construction work maybe in the next months or years. We have some intercultural universities. However, I think that one of the greatest challenges that we have now is that, well, the students who leave these universities, these intercultural universities, they often do not find workplaces where their knowledge is really appreciated because they learn a lot about traditional practices, but in, let's say, for example, sometimes they learn about traditional ways of helping women give birth, but healthcare institutions do not appreciate that knowledge and they do not really give them any opportunities to find work. And where what they have studied is seen as something that is valuable. So these are some of the things that we are now fighting to change. And this new university that we have agreed to build, this first African Mexican university, we hope to actually address this problem as well. And why do we call it an African Mexican university? Because it will be built in an area where we have a large number of African Mexican people. It is a place where we get more African Mexican people going to, and they actually don't even have any university near that area. So usually these are young people who have to leave their territory and go to other states to go to university. And this is a way for them to not be forced out of their territories to study. And it is also a way for us to have a place where these traditional practices are indeed appreciated. Of course, now we have to discuss the syllabus, that is, what type of disciplines are going to be studied and who is actually ready to work, to serve as professors in these universities. Because this is actually one of the problems that we see in intercultural universities now. Because they, for example, always force people to write their papers in Spanish. We did not have anyone that could speak local languages. Everything always had to be done in Spanish, which is something that, for example, exclude many indigenous communities because there are many indigenous individuals who do not speak Spanish. So this is still a big challenge. And we see that when these intercultural universities were founded, they were founded by people who do not really understand the communities that they serve. And when I talk about basic education, the textbooks have been revisited, and they have been revisited this year. So for the first time now, we have African Mexican people being mentioned in the textbook. We will talk about their history, about their culture, and we have made sure that the images and the illustrations are not as racist as they used to be. No, they're not racist at all as they used to be, because usually we only had Black people being shown in shackles to talk about slavery. And they also talk about the Black race, saying that they were stronger in terms of body type, and that's why they were enslaved to work. So there was a lot of racist language in those textbooks. And this was only changed because African Mexican people were finally heard, and we had an African Mexican movement that really worked with the Secretary of Education for them to understand their own perspectives, to talk about how African Mexican people also contributed to building Mexico, and talked about how proud we are of being who we are, because usually we only talked about enslaved people, and didn't even use the term enslaved people. They talked about slaves, and they talked about slaves coming from Africa as if Africa was a single country, as if there was no diversity of culture in Africa itself. And of course, we know we need to do much more. We need that to be seen in other textbooks and in other levels of education. And we also want that to be rolled out to all students. And we need teachers also to be retrained, because if you change the textbook, but if teachers are not taught to be anti-racist and to really embrace other perspectives, that nothing will change. And in terms of museums, we're also working to open a new room in the National Museum to talk about our history. But of course, there's still a lot more to do. For example, we have a Museum of Anthropology and History in Mexico that is very well known, but none of their rooms mention the history of the African Mexican people. And this is something that we have now demanded for. We want the museum to also change, and we have scholars helping us in that effort. We want to have a new room in these different museums to address our history. Because, of course, we can have a museum about our own people, but we believe that our history should be told inside other institutions, and this history has to be told in a way that makes us proud. And I believe that we have worked hard. There's a lot more to be done. And we learn from different countries where this has already been accomplished. Well, I think that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Celeste, for your contribution, and we're very happy to see that you're well and safe, and happy to have you back in our chat. Watatakalu, are you with us? Great. Would you like to answer to the second question? Education, right? Well, I had two separate experiences. I was taught in my indigenous community, and indigenous education is not done within four walls. So I learned a lot about life there, and I also spent 3 years in what we call reclusion here. So when an indigenous woman in my community first has her period, for the first 2 days, we do not eat anything. We do not drink water. We just focus on connecting with our own body, mind, and the world around us. And then for 3 years, we are taught by people who are separate from us by what we call curtains, though they are made of leaves. And we are taught every day by our grandparents and our elders about what we have to learn about life. And after 3 years, when we are 15, or when I was 15 at least, I went to an urban center to learn Portuguese, to learn white people's language, and it was completely different from everything I had known so far. Because I see that in urban centers, strangers teach your kids, which is something that is completely different from what I experienced in my community where my family taught me. But I had to learn about their ways because I had to learn about their language so I could even have my voice heard in their communities later on. So I could try to translate what indigenous communities want. And this message needs to be clearly understood by non-indigenous communities, by white communities. And why is that? Well, because we know that across the globe, indigenous people have always been heard through the voices of others who were not indigenous. You know, white people would come to us and then take our message to the rest of their community. And now we have to be able to speak our own voice and defend our own traditional ways. Now we know we have special schools in our territories, but I never went to an indigenous school. I have never been to university, but that was a choice that I made. When I was very young, I started fighting for indigenous rights. And either I had to abandon my struggles, abandon my activism to go to university, which would actually force me to give up much of what I had accomplished, or I could keep my fight. And what I have tried to do is to actually teach my kids all that I have learned while living in my community, but I know that they will never have what I had. I was taught by my four grandparents, and my daughter won't have what I had. And I really wanted my children to go to an indigenous school, but we also have to prepare our kids for the fight ahead of them. But there are so many challenges ahead of us because racism is something that we still see inside traditional schools, traditional universities, and public schools in Brazil do not respect our culture. We have to be seen differently because, yeah, okay, it's okay if we're different. We speak a different language, we have different customs. The indigenous calendar, which has been beautifully crafted by relatives who worked really hard for us to have the right of a exclusive education and special education in our communities. It's still being forced to change by white governments. My children today, for example, they study in a private white school. And why is that? So that they have the time to really then leave when they need to go to our communities for our festivities. Because if my children go to public school and they have to leave for our festivities, for our customs, they flunk that year because schools do not accept them missing class that day. And if we're talking about respecting indigenous people for who they are, the government currently says, oh, look at everything we're doing for indigenous people. We protect their forests, but that's not true. It's it's not something you see translated into real practice. So we have to fight for it. And I believe that for us, there's no education outside our territories that really promote respect towards the environment. When we go to university today to speak, sometimes because sometimes we are invited as guest speakers to really teach people. And these are usually master students, PhD students, and we teach them how to care for the forest, how to really protect the environment. Because we see people talking a lot about that, but very little is done. They spend millions and millions of reais or dollars in these conferences on climate change, but we see very little come out of it. How can we get that to real people, to real, like to individuals through education? And I see that we really need to educate our children as part of our culture. And I fight for that every day because education is the only way ahead if we want to save our planet. And the planet is not only the home of indigenous people, it is the home of everyone who lives here. Protecting 80% of our biodiversity is fundamental, is crucial, and I don't think people see why. And that's why we have to educate people. And indigenous people know that because we learn about it from our very early days. I learned about that in my culture, and then I studied a bit about the white man's culture on that so that I can translate it. And my mom used to say that after I learned English, I did not have to learn anything else because people who only study as white people, they are content with the books and they forget to act. but we need to act. And that's why I try to balance the two things. I believe that the best university that I could ever have is Indigenous movement, Indigenous activism, where I learned so much. I learned so much from our elders. So I think this is what I had to say. And thank you so very much for everything that you shared as well. Oh, thank you so very much to each and every one of you who have shared your knowledge, your experience with us here today in this chat. And indeed, I believe that this forum has shown us everything that we can do together, including everything that is possible in terms of our fight. So thank you so very much for your contributions. I really thank you from the bottom of my heart for everything you have done, and I wish you all the strength to continue the fight so that we can leave a better world to the next generations. And without further ado, and given we have very little time now, and no problem, because I know that it is not something that we can exhaust here, but I hand it to Maria John for her to share her comments before we end. And again, thank you so very much, and I wish that God blesses all of you in your fight. Thank you.
Can you all hear me okay? Okay, fantastic. I want to start obviously with an enormous thank you to all of our panelists who have joined us today from all your different locations fighting, technological as well as environmental disruptions. It's such a privilege to be able to share this space with all of you. Katerina, Watutakalu, Catherine, Celeste, Valentina, Daniela, Marianne. I'm so grateful for the invitation to do a very hard job, which is to add some final words to what has been a really inspiring panel. I don't see my job so much here to be, kind of having the final word, perhaps more so just sort of amplifying and underscoring the lessons, the calls to action, and the urgency of so many of the things that that were shared with us today. So I want to begin by just acknowledging how inspiring it has been to see a centering of Indigenous and Afro-descendant women's voices, experiences, and their labor, which, especially in academic spaces, so often goes unnoticed, unrecognized, unengaged, or else gets co-opted into and claimed by others or by institutions. When Daniela graciously sort of, invited me to be a part of this conversation, and she introduced the idea of the panel to me, she spent a lot of time reflecting on how so much of the activism and labor of women, especially Afro-descendant and Indigenous women, gets marginalized or missed altogether in representations, histories, and narratives about the work of activists. And this is at least in part due to the dominance of English within academic publishing, and all the ways in which this as well contributes to the marginalization of voices. And so I think it's worth pointing out at the very beginning here that, at so many levels, even just in the form that this panel takes with its simultaneous translation, that what we've witnessed and experienced here today really is a living example and a model of how we can do better within institutions of learning to step outside of structures and modalities that are inherently reinforcing colonial or other forms of domination and exclusion, even if this is something as foundational as engaging in a different language. I think, as several of our panelists noted, Indigenous and Afro-descendant women have always, historically and today, been doing the work of activism for their communities, often without much support or recognition, sometimes even under threat to their safety. But while that's always been true, our panelists have also reminded us that we cannot lose sight of how the struggle of and by women to keep their place at the table, even within the activist movements, has been and still is hard fought. And then, of course, as I think both Catherine and Celeste especially reminded us, there is the struggle to push back against the erasure of this women's political and activist work within history. And so what all speakers have shown is that so many of the successes won within Indigenous politics, whether it's the environment or struggles around culture or language or education, access, political representation. These are the result of struggles carried by and led by women, but also that these have been intergenerational struggles, and that the struggles being continued today are at once the legacy of histories of slavery, territorial displacement, cultural and political erasure, but also the legacy of long histories of resistance, intergenerational histories of both oppression and resistance. And I think a great example of these intergenerational continuities in terms of both the injustices and the resistances, both Catherine and Celeste referred to how the legacies of slavery have had a direct impact on where Afro-descendant communities are left in both Ecuador and Mexico. Akalu have talked about how their experiences as young children and then as young Indigenous women shaped their gravitation towards the political movements and activism that they are now leading. They have carried forward the activist struggles of their families and their communities. And what all of this underscores is how activism is simultaneously both a choice for many women, but also for many how it is not a choice, and it's simply what's required for survival. Survival of cultures, survival of language and Indigenous knowledge, survival of communities, families, and survival of land. And so all of this and the shared urgency of all the Indigenous activism we have learned about today also underscores the significance of networks and solidarities within Afro-Indigenous political activism. By foregrounding the global solidarities of Indigenous politics in our understandings of these movements and their histories, I think what each of the panelists and this forum as a whole helps us to see so clearly is how very pervasive through time and place the enduring structures and systems of colonialism in all of its forms are today. Because in situating their present day struggles and their activism in the much longer context of struggles engaged historically by Indigenous peoples across the globe, we are reminded by the panelists that colonialism persists and continues to structure our world. Its effects, its consequences, its very continuance is evidenced in the systems of capital, education, and institutional power that continue to privilege certain voices. And so this panel, by centering Indigenous and Afro-descendant women, their communities, their voices, their histories, their knowledge, provides a powerful and also inspiring example of how important it is and actually how possible it is for institutional spaces to be created that do center Indigenous knowledge and voices. And likewise, in the activist work described by so many of our panelists today, we see how much grassroots work is already being done, but which also needs greater support to create spaces for Indigenous representation, whether it's in academic or educational settings, medical settings, political settings. And so in closing, I think it's really worth considering a possible call to action here, especially for those of us who work in the educational sector, that I think we heard in all of the stories, experiences, and knowledge of the panelists that was shared today, but also in the very model or example that has been set by this panel itself. And this is the urgency and significance for all of us of centering Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous voices. Because as Watutakalu just kind of ended with in her final comments, you know, these are the communities who historically have been on the front lines of environmental and territorial destruction, and which sadly is a future that I think lies ahead of all of us, right? And so as a kind of parting thought or a final thought, I wanted to share the words of an Aboriginal elder, Lilla Watson, a Gangaloo woman who grew up in the Dawson River region of central Queensland in Australia, which is where I'm from. And it's a quote that Watson shared in the context of the 1985 United Nations Decade for Women's Conference in Nairobi. And she said at that time, if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I think in her words and in all the stories and the knowledge that we have learned today from all of our incredible panelists, I think this is something that that we can all carry forward with us from this panel. So I wanted to thank everybody again for being here, for all of the knowledge that was shared, and to thank our organizers for making this possible.
María, por tus comentarios finales. Me voy.
Maria, for your final comments. I'm very, very happy with what we have accomplished here again. And with that, I hand it over back to Daniela or Marianne Salom for her final words as well. And then we can wrap up.
Bom, quero agradecer imensamente a
Well,
presença.
thank you so very much for joining us this evening and for sharing and being so generous at how you shared your experience and knowledge. I'm sure we could spend days talking about these topics. They are not exhausted here, and I hope we can get together again in the future. Here, we know that we have a lot yet to learn about how we can fight racism and colonialism and how we can protect traditional territories, the environment, and protect also languages and cultures from erasure. There is a lot more that we can do together. And we have to remember that this is a global fight for our own survival. We see everything that these women have to share. They are incredible voices carrying out wisdom from their ancestors. And at the same time that they work towards gender equality in their own communities, they also fight for the communities, not only in their own territories, but across borders, reminding us that social justice is something that we all have to engage on. I hope that these solidarity networks are just in their first steps here, and that more women, regardless of where they are, can connect towards a common goal. With that, thank you so very much for joining us today. These recordings will be available in our channel on YouTube on all 3 languages. Thank you so very much, Cleberson Mora from the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, for helping us with the tech support. And I don't know if Daniela has any final words as well. Otherwise, we can end. And oh, yeah, sure. I'd like to thank Valentina for being the moderator of our panel. Yeah, I just want to second what Marianne said. And I want to thank Maria Jones for her comments. Thank everyone who joined us for this panel. You will also find the first seminar we had in our channel. This will make you more familiar with what we intend to promote here with this initiative. And as Marianne and Maria have said, this is just the beginning. We have to continue these discussions inside our educational institutions, and with our community so that we can learn from different sources. So that's why I think the women who share the experience here, and please know that we are here as allies and we want to support you in all your fights, because we know that this is indeed required for the progress of Latin America. And with that, we thank you for your presentation and your time. See you next time.